Lieutenant Sarah Chen stepped out of the military transport vehicle, her boots hitting the dusty ground of forward operating base Phoenix. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as she adjusted her uniform and grabbed her single duffel bag. Around her, soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, but she could feel their curious stares burning into her back. At 26, Sarah looked younger than her years, with her small frame and quiet demeanor. She had requested this assignment to one of the most challenging bases in the region, much to everyone's surprise back at headquarters. Most officers avoided Phoenix like the plague. It was known for its harsh conditions and even harsher personnel. "You must be the new communications officer," called out a gruff voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Sergeant Major Burke approaching, his massive frame casting a shadow over her. Behind him stood a group of seasoned soldiers, their arms crossed and expressions skeptical. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Chen reporting for duty," Sarah replied calmly, extending her hand. Burke looked at her hand for a moment before reluctantly shaking it. "Well, Chen, I hope you're tougher than you look. This isn't some cushy desk job back in the States. Out here, we don't have time to babysit fresh-faced officers who think they know everything." The soldiers behind Burke snickered quietly. Sarah noticed how they exchanged glances, already writing her off as just another inexperienced officer who would crack under pressure. "I understand, Sergeant Major. I'm here to do my job," Sarah responded evenly, not letting their attitudes rattle her. Burke led her through the base, pointing out various facilities with minimal enthusiasm. The communications center was a cramped, poorly ventilated building filled with outdated equipment. "This is your kingdom, Princess," Burke said mockingly. "Try not to break anything important." As Burke walked away, Sarah heard him mutter to his men, "Give her a week. These college types never last long when reality hits." Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into her work. She arrived early and stayed late, familiarizing herself with the base's communication systems and protocols. The equipment was indeed outdated, much of it held together with makeshift repairs and sheer determination. The other soldiers watched her with a mixture of amusement and disdain. During meals in the mess hall, conversations would quiet when she approached, only to resume in hushed tones after she passed. She ate alone, ignored by groups who had clearly decided she didn't belong. Corporal Martinez, one of the radio technicians, seemed particularly hostile. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's not how we do things here," he would say whenever Sarah suggested improvements or asked questions about procedures. His tone dripped with condescension, making it clear he thought she was clueless. "The previous officer never had problems with our systems," Martinez continued during one particularly tense exchange. "Maybe you should stick to what you know instead of trying to fix something that isn't broken." Sarah bit back her response, choosing instead to document the various inefficiencies and safety concerns she observed. The communication protocols were outdated. The backup systems were unreliable, and the security measures were insufficient for a base of this importance. Captain Rodriguez, the base's second-in-command, seemed more approachable than the others, but even he maintained a polite distance. "The men just need time to warm up to you," he told Sarah during a brief encounter. "They've been through a lot together, and they're protective of their routine." But Sarah could see it wasn't just about routine. There was something else, an undercurrent of resentment that went beyond the usual hazing of new personnel. The soldiers acted as if her presence was an insult, as if someone her age and appearance had no business being there. During her first week, a critical communication failure occurred during a routine patrol. The radio systems crashed, leaving a squad temporarily cut off from base contact. While Sarah worked frantically to restore communications, she could hear Burke's voice in the background, loud enough for her to hear. "This is exactly what happens when they send us kids to do an adult's job," Burke complained to Rodriguez. "That girl has no idea what she's doing. We need someone with real experience, not some fresh academy graduate who thinks textbook knowledge is enough. Sarah's jaw tightened as she continued working. She managed to restore communications within 15 minutes, ensuring the patrol's safe return, but the damage was done. Word spread quickly that the new girl had caused a system failure, even though Sarah knew the crash was due to aging hardware, not operator error. The next morning, Sarah found her workspace subtly sabotaged. Equipment had been moved, important cables were loose, and several of her carefully organized technical manuals were missing. When she questioned Martinez about it, he shrugged innocently. "Sorry, ma'am, I haven't seen anything. Maybe you just misplaced them? It happens to the best of us when we're new and overwhelmed." The pattern continued throughout her second week. Small acts of disrespect and undermining became routine. Her suggestions were dismissed without consideration, her orders were followed with obvious reluctance, and her expertise was constantly questioned. During a staff meeting, Colonel Harris, the base commander, outlined upcoming operations that would require enhanced communication coordination. Sarah raised her hand to suggest implementing encrypted backup channels she had noticed were missing from their current setup. "With respect, Colonel, our current communications infrastructure has some vulnerabilities that could be addressed with relatively simple upgrades," Sarah began. Burke interrupted before she could finish. "Sir, our systems have served us well for years. I think we should focus on proven methods rather than experimental ideas from someone who's been here 5 minutes." The room murmured in agreement, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with frustration. Colonel Harris nodded thoughtfully, but ultimately sided with Burke's recommendation to stick with existing protocols. After the meeting, Sarah overheard Burke talking to a group of senior non-commissioned officers outside the building. "Someone needs to have a conversation with headquarters about their assignment decisions," he said. "Sending us green officers who think they can revolutionize everything overnight isn't helping anyone." That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, reviewing personnel files and trying to understand the base's dynamics. She had faced challenges before, but never such systematic dismissal of her capabilities. Part of her wanted to request a transfer, to find a posting where her skills would be appreciated. But something deeper kept her rooted in place. She had worked too hard and overcome too many obstacles to let a group of stubborn soldiers drive her away. There was more to this situation than simple resistance to change, and she was determined to prove herself, regardless of their preconceptions. As she closed her laptop that night, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would not only succeed at this assignment, but she would earn their respect through her actions, not their approval through conformity. What they didn't know about her background might surprise them, but she would let her work speak for itself. The real test, she suspected, was yet to come. The alarm pierced through the early morning quiet of forward operating base Phoenix like a knife. Sarah bolted upright in her bunk, instantly alert despite having worked until well past midnight upgrading the communication systems. Red emergency lights bathed the corridors as soldiers rushed to their positions with practiced urgency. Within minutes, Sarah was in the communications center, her fingers flying across keyboards as reports flooded in. A convoy carrying critical medical supplies had been ambushed 15 kilometers from the base. 3 vehicles were disabled, multiple casualties were reported, and enemy forces had the convoy pinned down in a narrow valley with limited escape routes. "Get me a clear channel to Viper Squad," Colonel Harris commanded as he burst into the communications center, still pulling on his tactical vest. "I need to coordinate immediate air support." Sarah's heart sank as she tried to establish contact. The radio crackled with static and interference. "Sir, something's wrong with the primary communication array. We're getting massive interference on all military frequencies." Burke rushed in behind the colonel, his face grim. "What do you mean we can't communicate? Chen, what did you do to our equipment?" "I didn't do anything wrong," Sarah replied firmly, continuing to work through diagnostic procedures. "This appears to be deliberate jamming. Someone is blocking our signals using sophisticated equipment." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Without communication, they couldn't coordinate rescue operations, call for air support, or even warn other patrols in the area about the threat. The convoy was trapped, bleeding, and running out of time. "This is unacceptable," Burke growled, pushing Sarah aside to try the radio himself. "These systems worked fine before you started messing with them." "Sergeant Major, with respect, let me work," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. She had identified the source of the jamming and was working on a solution. But Burke's interference was making everything harder. Colonel Harris watched the exchange with growing concern. "Burke, step back. Chen, how long until communications are restored?" Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. The jamming was more sophisticated than anything local insurgents typically used, which meant they were dealing with a well-equipped enemy force. Standard counter-jamming procedures wouldn't work against this level of interference. "Sir, I need to try something unconventional," Sarah said, moving to a bank of equipment that most of the base personnel assumed was obsolete. "The enemy is jamming our primary frequencies, but they might have overlooked older backup systems." "Obsolete equipment won't help us now," Martinez interjected from his position at another workstation. "Ma'am, we need real solutions, not desperate experiments." But Sarah was already deep in technical mode, connecting cables and adjusting settings on equipment that hadn't been used in months. Her fingers moved with the confidence of someone who understood not just how to operate the systems, but how they were built and why they worked. "Chen, what are you doing?" Colonel Harris asked, watching her work with growing interest. "Creating a frequency-hopping communication network using older analog equipment that's harder to jam," Sarah explained while continuing to work. "The enemy is using digital jamming techniques that won't affect these older systems as severely." Burke shook his head in disbelief. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. We're trusting our soldiers' lives to some theoretical approach from someone who's been here less than a month." The tension in the room was thick as Sarah made final adjustments. Everyone's eyes were on her as she attempted to establish contact with the trapped convoy. Static filled the room for several agonizing seconds before a voice crackled through the speakers. "Phoenix Base, this is Viper 6. Can you read me?" Relief washed over Colonel Harris's face. "Viper 6, this is Phoenix Actual. We read you clearly. Report your status." The convoy leader's voice was strained but clear. "Phoenix Actual, we have multiple wounded and are taking heavy fire from elevated positions. We need immediate dust-off for casualties and combat support to break contact." Sarah had done it. Against all odds, and despite the skepticism of her colleagues, she had established critical communication when the standard systems failed. But her work was far from over. "Sir," Sarah said to Colonel Harris, "I can maintain this communication channel, but I need to coordinate with multiple assets simultaneously. The current setup won't handle the volume of traffic we're about to generate." Without waiting for permission, Sarah began implementing a communications strategy she had learned in advanced warfare school. She established multiple backup channels, created redundant communication paths, and set up automated protocols that would keep information flowing even if individual systems failed. Captain Rodriguez watched in amazement as Sarah orchestrated the complex rescue operation. "Colonel, she's managing communications with the convoy, medical evacuation helicopters, close air support, and our quick reaction force all simultaneously." "How is that possible?" Burke asked, his hostility replaced by genuine confusion. "The old communication doctrine says you can only handle 2 primary channels effectively." Sarah glanced up briefly from her work. "The old doctrine assumed linear communication management. I'm using parallel processing techniques that allow for simultaneous multi-channel coordination." For the next 3 hours, Sarah became the nerve center of a complex military operation. She guided helicopters through enemy fire to evacuate wounded soldiers, directed artillery strikes against enemy positions, and coordinated the movement of ground forces to rescue the trapped convoy. Her voice remained calm and professional, even as reports of casualties and enemy contact filled the airwaves. She processed information faster than anyone in the communications center had ever seen, making split-second decisions that kept the rescue operation running smoothly. Viper 6, adjust your position 50 meters north. Medical evacuation helicopter will be approaching from the southeast in approximately 3 minutes, Sarah transmitted while simultaneously coordinating with artillery units to provide covering fire. Burke stood behind her, watching in stunned silence. The same equipment he had dismissed as worthless was now performing at levels he hadn't thought possible. The same officer he had written off as inexperienced was managing a crisis with skills that surpassed anyone he had worked with. "Dust-off complete," came the report from the medical helicopter. "All casualties are secured and en route to the field hospital. Phoenix Actual, this is Viper 6. We're mobile and moving to Extraction Point Bravo. Thanks to your communication coordination, we're bringing everyone home." As the immediate crisis passed, the communications center gradually returned to normal operations. Sarah remained at her station, monitoring the ongoing situation and ensuring all units returned safely to base. Colonel Harris approached her workstation, his expression thoughtful. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant. That was some of the finest communication management I've seen in 25 years of military service." Sarah looked up from her screens, finally allowing herself to show a hint of fatigue. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my job." But Burke wasn't finished processing what he had witnessed. "Chen, where did you learn to do that? That wasn't standard military communication procedure." Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room at the faces watching her expectantly. "I've had some additional training beyond the basic officer course," she said carefully. Captain Rodriguez frowned thoughtfully. "What kind of additional training? That level of coordination requires specialized education and experience." Before Sarah could respond, Colonel Harris received an urgent message on his personal communication device. As he read it, his expression changed dramatically, shifting from curiosity to something that looked almost like shock. "Lieutenant Chen," he said slowly, "I think we need to have a private conversation. My office?" "Immediately." As Sarah followed the colonel out of the communications center, she could feel the eyes of every person in the room watching her departure. The crisis had been resolved, but something told her that an even more significant revelation was about to unfold. Burke turned to Martinez with a puzzled expression. "What just happened here? And why do I get the feeling we've been missing something important about our new communications officer?" The answer to that question was about to change everything they thought they knew about the quiet young woman who had just saved their brothers in arms. Colonel Harris closed his office door and gestured for Sarah to take a seat. The message on his communication device was still glowing on the screen, and his expression remained unreadable as he processed the information he had just received. "Lieutenant Chen," he began slowly, "I just received some very interesting information from Central Command. It seems there's been a significant oversight in how you were introduced to this base." Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She had been dreading this moment since her arrival, knowing that eventually someone would look beyond the surface and discover the truth about her background. "According to this message," Colonel Harris continued, reading from his device, "you're not just any communications officer. You're Lieutenant Sarah Chen, formerly of the 75th Ranger Regiment, Special Operations Communications Specialist, and current holder of the Department of Defense's highest certification in electronic warfare and counterintelligence operations." The silence in the office was deafening. Colonel Harris set down his device and looked directly at Sarah. "You're also the youngest person ever to achieve Level 5 security clearance for communications intelligence, and you've been specifically assigned here by the Pentagon to evaluate and upgrade our strategic communication capabilities." Sarah finally spoke, her voice steady. "Yes, sir. That's correct." "Why didn't you tell us this when you arrived?" Colonel Harris asked. though his tone suggested he might already understand the answer. My orders were to conduct an unbiased assessment of base operations and personnel readiness, Sarah explained. If everyone knew my background and mission from the beginning, it would have compromised the evaluation. I needed to see how the base functioned under normal conditions. Colonel Harris leaned back in his chair, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The equipment upgrades you've been suggesting, the communication protocols you implemented during the crisis today, you weren't just making educated guesses, were you? No, sir. I was identifying critical vulnerabilities in our defensive capabilities. Today's jamming attack wasn't conducted by local insurgents. Based on the frequency patterns and jamming techniques, we're dealing with a sophisticated enemy force that has detailed intelligence about our communication systems. The full implications of what Sarah was saying began to sink in. Colonel Harris straightened in his chair. Are you telling me that we have a serious security breach? I'm telling you that someone with advanced technical knowledge and significant resources is actively targeting this base. The attack on the convoy was likely a test to see how we would respond when our communications were compromised. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device. I've been monitoring and recording all communication traffic since my arrival. With your permission, I'd like to share my findings with you and your senior staff. 20 minutes later, Colonel Harris had assembled his key personnel in the secure briefing room. Sergeant Major Burke, Captain Rodriguez, and the other senior non-commissioned officers sat around the table, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Gentlemen, Colonel Harris announced, I'd like to properly introduce Lieutenant Sarah Chen. She's here on direct orders from the Pentagon to evaluate our operations and identify security vulnerabilities. Burke's jaw dropped. Sir, with respect, she's been here less than a month. How could she? Sergeant Major, Colonel Harris interrupted. Lieutenant Chen holds advanced certifications in electronic warfare, has served with special operations units, and possesses security clearances that exceed my own. She's also just identified a significant threat to base security. Sarah stood and activated a portable presentation device. The communication jamming we experienced today was conducted using military-grade equipment typically only available to state-sponsored forces. The jamming patterns indicate detailed knowledge of our communication protocols and equipment specifications. She clicked to the next slide, showing frequency analysis charts that meant little to most of the people in the room, but clearly impressed Captain Rodriguez, who had an engineering background. Furthermore, Sarah continued, I've identified 17 separate security vulnerabilities in our current communication infrastructure, 12 protocol weaknesses that could allow unauthorized access to classified information, and evidence suggesting that someone has been monitoring our communication traffic for at least 6 weeks. The room was completely silent. Burke stared at the young woman he had dismissed as an inexperienced college graduate, trying to reconcile her appearance with the sophisticated analysis she was presenting. Ma'am, Burke said slowly, when you say monitoring our traffic, do you mean... I mean, someone has been intercepting and recording our communications, including patrol schedules, supply convoy routes, and personnel assignments. Today's ambush was possible because the enemy knew exactly when and where that convoy would be traveling. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. They hadn't just been dealing with random insurgent attacks. They had been facing a coordinated intelligence operation. Captain Rodriguez raised his hand. Lieutenant, what's your recommendation for addressing these vulnerabilities? Sarah clicked to her next slide, revealing a comprehensive security upgrade plan. Complete overhaul of communication protocols, implementation of frequency-hopping encrypted systems, establishment of backup communication networks, and installation of counter-surveillance equipment. How long would that take? Colonel Harris asked. With proper support from headquarters, approximately 2 weeks for critical systems, 6 weeks for complete implementation. Burke looked up from the briefing materials. Ma'am, I need to ask, why did you let us treat you the way we did? You could have shut down our attitudes immediately by revealing your background. Sarah considered the question carefully. Sergeant Major, my mission was to evaluate how this base operates under normal conditions. If I had pulled rank or revealed my background, I would have seen what you wanted me to see, not what actually happens day to day. She looked around the room at each of the senior personnel. I needed to understand the real chain of command, the actual communication procedures, and the genuine relationships between personnel. That information was crucial for identifying where security weaknesses exist. Martinez, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke up. So when we were giving you a hard time about the communication equipment, you were demonstrating exactly how resistant to change the base personnel are, and how willing people are to dismiss valid security concerns when they come from unexpected sources, Sarah replied diplomatically. Colonel Harris stood up. Gentlemen, let me be clear. Lieutenant Chen's evaluation period is over. From this moment forward, she's taking charge of all communication security operations for this base. Her recommendations will be implemented immediately, and she has my full authority to make whatever changes are necessary. Burke stood as well, his posture noticeably different than it had been an hour earlier. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We were completely out of line, and we let our preconceptions cloud our judgment. Sergeant Major, no apology necessary. Your reactions provided valuable intelligence about how information flows through the base and where potential security weak points exist in our human systems. Captain Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. All this time, you were 3 steps ahead of us, and we didn't even realize we were being evaluated. That was the point, Sarah said with a slight smile. Effective intelligence work requires seeing things as they really are, not as people want you to believe they are. Over the following weeks, the transformation of Forward Operating Base Phoenix was remarkable. Sarah's communication upgrades eliminated the security vulnerabilities she had identified, and her training programs brought the entire communication staff up to advanced operational standards. More importantly, the base personnel learned to look beyond surface appearances when evaluating people's capabilities. Burke became one of Sarah's strongest supporters, often telling new arrivals that the most dangerous mistake they could make was underestimating someone based on first impressions. The enemy forces that had been monitoring the base found their intelligence suddenly worthless, as new encryption protocols and communication security measures made their surveillance impossible. Attacks against convoys and patrols dropped dramatically as the enemy lost their primary source of tactical information. 6 months later, Forward Operating Base Phoenix received recognition as the most secure and efficiently operated base in the region. Sarah's comprehensive security improvements became the standard model for bases throughout the theater of operations. During a farewell ceremony before Sarah's transfer to her next assignment, Colonel Harris addressed the assembled personnel. Lieutenant Chen came to us as a test, and we failed that test initially. But she also gave us the opportunity to learn and improve, both as individuals and as a unit. Burke stepped forward with a presentation box. Ma'am, this base runs more efficiently and securely than it ever has, thanks to your expertise and professionalism. More importantly, you taught us that leadership and competence come in many forms, and it's our job to recognize and respect those qualities regardless of who displays them. As Sarah prepared to leave Forward Operating Base Phoenix, she reflected on the lessons learned by everyone involved. The soldiers had discovered that their assumptions about capability and experience could be dangerously wrong. She had learned that sometimes the most effective way to create change is to allow people to discover the truth for themselves. Most importantly, everyone had learned that respect must be earned through actions and competence, not demanded through rank or intimidation. Sarah's quiet professionalism had accomplished more than any amount of posturing or authority-wielding could have achieved. The young woman who had arrived as the underestimated new girl left as a respected leader whose influence would continue long after her departure. Her methods had proven that sometimes the best way to reveal people's true character is to give them the opportunity to show it naturally without interference or manipulation. Forward operating base. Phoenix would never make the same mistake again.